Welcome to Dr. Akmal Makhdum's YouTube channel. He is a psychiatrist, author, and social commentator. Continuing on from our conversations about forgotten philosophies, Dr. Akmal Makhdum will now be exploring ancient philosophers. So, which philosophers have you decided to discuss with us today?
Today, we would like to talk about two philosophers, Socrates and Plato. The thing about Socrates is that because he didn't write anything, and it's very interesting why he chose not to write anything, it's presumed why. Um, so, whatever we know about Socrates is through Plato and all the 36 pieces of literature and philosophy that he wrote. And the interesting thing is that the world of Western philosophy is actually delineated, and the line is Socrates. So it's the pre Socratics and the post Socratics. So if you see the impact of a person who never wrote anything, not a single word in his life, Socrates, and philosophy is actually all his doing. Now, when we talk of Socrates, we know that he died in about 399 BC, so just 400 BC is roughly the time when things started to go downhill, and he was sentenced to death, and he chose to remain in Athens and his beloved city, and he drank hemlock and he died. And all that is then written about by his contemporaries and his students like Plato and Xenophon, etc. Now, in terms of Socrates, what I'd like to say is that the difference between Socrates and pre Socratic philosophers, Pythagoras, etc., all brilliant people, all mathematicians, scholars of geometry, etc., and philosophy, the difference was that Plato actually brought, Socrates actually brought philosophy and thinking about individual life. So the way Socrates worked was that he would go to the agora, the marketplace in Athens, and then pick up a little discussion with somebody. And he would always claim, and he always claimed that he didn't know much. And he actually stated at the end that the real wisdom is knowing that you do not know much. And one of the two reasons why he didn't write anything, that he believed that he didn't know much. So how could he write? The other thing that experts say is why he didn't write any written word is that he wanted questions to be asked all the time about everything. And what he believed was that word on a book is immobile, is not malleable. It does not respond. You cannot argue with it. It just gives you a wisdom, and it does not change. So that is why he believed that, I think, that's my personal view, is contrary to his belief that, he didn't know much. So why should he put anything on paper, especially something that will be immobile, that will be unchanged, and nobody would be able to challenge or question or alter that. So if it were a live book or a living book, which would change according to a discussion, and so that's where Socrates came. The other thing that Socrates brought to the world, that pre-Socratic philosophy was about God's control of man. You read Iliad, Odyssey, all these old epics of great warrior heroes, great adventures, and you always see that man and God are absolutely interwoven. uh, gods are constantly interfering and controlling man. And sometimes gods are pretty evil and devious in that. But that's what the old philosophers were talking about, and this is what life was all about: the influence of powers which were not in man's control, how things happened. And that was the explanation of the previous philosophers of how, why things happened, that it was either Zeus or Poseidon or whoever, Aphrodite and Venus, etc. So and they affected man, and most of the morality that mankind lived, or those Athenians or the Greeks lived, were based on those epics and on those god-man interactions. What Socrates does is he actually brings the whole thing crashing down on the individual. So what he does is he says, okay, so how are you? Should we talk about something? So it's just like, sitting on a with a street vendor or somebody walking down the street, and he picks up this conversation, and he says, okay, what do you do, and so how do you live, and then basic concept of, like, people, as it is mentioned, about courage or about knowledge. And so he approached people about things which everybody believes or believed that they know anything about, or they know all about it. For example, love. For example, courage. For example, wisdom, knowledge, beauty,
Honor.
ethics, morality. So a basic question would say, okay, so what's beauty? And what he realizes, or makes the other person realize, is that they really don't know much about it. They really can't define it. And so what Socrates brought mankind to think was describe things, the ability to describe. So, what is wisdom? What is knowledge? What is courage? What is beauty? What is virtue? And that is where I think that's why he's the most important line that appears in the world of Western philosophy, where there is all man and God, God and man constantly interacting prior to that. And then Socrates brings the philosophy and the focus down to mankind and says, okay, how do you want to live? What values do you want to live with? And somebody says, I want to live a moral life. Okay, so what do you mean by moral? Define moral. Because if you do not know what moral is, how can you lead that life? If you do not what beauty is, how can you appreciate beauty? If you do not know what courage is, how can you live a courageous life? So that's where I think you see a complete transformation of philosophy in the Western history, where it is changed. And because he didn't write anything, and he was a great personality, as described by his contemporaries, highly charismatic, simply clothed, very provocative, sometimes quite in your face kind of a person, but generally very humble, extremely knowledgeable, but never ever taking the knowledgeable role, always saying and always believing that he didn't know. And so the thing was that because he didn't write anything, and he died a martyr's death, and he was described as this super courageous person who took his death with such equanimity and courage, somebody who knew himself, somebody who could be always courageous, somebody who could be always in self control. He actually is described by then his contemporary, especially Plato. And Plato then appears as probably the greatest written philosopher. And people have been saying repeatedly that, as somebody put it, that the whole of Western philosophy is a series of footnotes to the work of Plato. So that's the level of his greatness.
Amazing. So now that we know about Socrates, so we have a few minutes. Let's discuss Plato's role in all of this and what he had to say.
Now, Plato was the person, of course, who wrote everything down. So we know that Socrates existed, how he lived, what he said through Plato. But the thing is that Plato doesn't write as Plato. What Plato does is that he creates these interlocutors, he creates these characters, sometimes his own brother Glaucon, or sometimes some other contemporaries and his colleagues who studied with or talked with Socrates. He uses them having a dialogue with Socrates. So, and that's how he describes everything. There could be many reasons behind it. Many have been stated, obviously, and some of them I will share. And some of it, I also believe that may be to do with the circumstances.
Could he
There
also
was,
be saying it's Socrates to save himself from retribution from.
yeah, I mean, that's the thing that he uses. There are two things that, or two ways it can be looked at. One is that Socrates was sentenced to death after democracy came back, after the 30 tyrants who were ruling, the aristocracy that was ruling Athens, and immediately afterwards, the democracy sentenced Socrates to death, and Plato probably used Socrates in his work to say whatever he wanted to say. But that may be in the later part of his writings in the later years. But obviously he was there, and Socrates was such a charismatic, ever-present place, a presence in that place that Plato recreated him and made him alive.
Okay.
What Plato did was to promote this process, that how thinking was important, how reason was important. So if you sense something and you don't know much about it, you must use your reason. So, mental ability. Then he also believed that your interactions, your relationships should change you. Now, there is this thing I really like about, when I heard this, that people say, oh, I love you the way you are. He didn't believe in that. He said, but that should not be the case. The lover should be able to, should be the one whom you should admire and try to be like that. And the real love is admiration. Being the way you are means actually remaining in a state of stagnation and possibly decay. So the important thing is that if you have a partner or a lover or a friend, that must improve you, and you must be improved by that person, and vice versa. So the lover should look at you as somebody who improves them, and you should be improved by the lover. Now, that is one. The other thing is that he also believed in social reform, because he was at the cusp of a very turbulent time in his city-state Athens. They'd lost a war with Sparta, a 30-year war that destroyed, the whole of their region, and they had been beaten after that war. Then they had aristocrats and tyrants ruling them, which was selected by the occupiers, and then came democracy. So in that turbulent time, and then one of the leading scholars and philosophers of the land is put to death. So then he talks about the construction and the configuration of the state, and we can talk about that because one of the most important things that he talks about, the republic, the Platonic state,
Okay.
utopia that he talks about.
Wonderful. So we'll discuss that in the next episode. But thank you so much for joining us today. And if you guys have anything to say about Socrates or ask any questions, do leave a comment below. If you liked it, subscribe and share. Thank you so much.